Help support this channel and get early access to videos plus exclusive content and patrons-only live discussions by becoming a member at patreon.com/BrucePoinsett. Welcome back to the Working Artist Working Title Project. I'm your host, Bruce Poinsett, and on today's episode, I speak with Damaris Webb. Damaris is a performer, theater maker, and teaching artist based here in Portland, Oregon. Her work lives in the intersection of contemplative dance, improvisational performance art, and contemporary theater. You can often find it in non-traditional performance venues, such as late night parties, warehouses, and church basements. And by our own admission, sometimes it could be epic, may involve zombies, or superheroes, or even sock puppets. I've gotten to know Damaris over the years through working with the Vanport Mosaic, for which she's a co-founder. And the Vanport Mosaic is a nonprofit memory activism platform that's dedicated to presenting, celebrating, and preserving the silence histories of the Pacific Northwest in order to better understand and organize towards a better present. So we covered a lot, and Damaris is just I can't put words like just how insightful she is. So I'll let you see for yourself. Check it out. Damaris, thank you for joining me today. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing pretty good, Bruce. I'm glad that we can have a conversation.
Yeah, no, we just early last week got done with an event for the Black Panther Legacy event through Vanport Mosaic Project, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this interview. But it's always nice just to actually get some time to like actually sit down.
Yeah.
It just talk like it. We're I think so caught up honestly like in just working, creating things, doing what we do. It often I find myself taking that for granted myself. So
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I'm grateful. Good.
So that said, just wanted to bring it back to we were talking off camera about how a little bit of this just kind of some like artist journey talk, but I think context is very important. So
yeah,
you start off with like how you, if I read correctly, if I do my research correctly, you spent a big chunk of your career in New York City, and you moved to Portland when?
well, I my family's from Portland,
Ah,
so yeah. I mean, the whole story is that my dad worked for USAID, and he owns the house that I live in. Well, my grandparents owned the house that I live in now, that I mostly grew up in, over here in Irvington. And my dad worked for USAID, and so he was stationed, or he took a tour in Tanzania, and he was a tax advisor. So he was working with African countries that were just becoming independent from British rule and helping them establish their own taxation systems. And I think about that because we're talking a little bit about the artist's journey and economics and how economics affect us.
hmm.
And when I was little, so we lived in Tanzania, which was where I was born, and we also lived in Botswana, and then returned back to Portland after those times. And I went to Irvington and then Jefferson High School. Um, but I think about that too, that when I was little, I couldn't quite grasp what my dad did, and it didn't seem very romantic or very like interesting.
Hmm.
But now I see how deciding where you want to put money and who pays what money for your society, for your country, your nation, is so impactful and says so much about the character of your country. So actually writing tax law is super reflective of of what you think is important, I think. So yay, Dad.
Hmm.
um and when we lived in Africa, when I was older and we lived in Botswana, so I was about like 8 years old. My parents with some other expatriates decided to do a play. And we lived in a place where there was no, Botswana had no electricity nationwide. There was only electricity in the capital, and the whole country there was like one paved road that ran through the middle of it. Otherwise it was kind of like that movie The Gods Must Be Crazy, if you remember that. It's like thatched roofs, we lived in government housing though, so we had a tin roof. But so they found like an old church, and they decided to put on a play. Hans Christian Andersen's the Snow Queen. I don't know why that one. And I got to play Winky the Robber Girl, who didn't have any lines, but I got to follow my mom on stage and have little like fake pistols because we like held up people. And it was a rare enough occurrence, this play, this production, that the president's wife of Botswana came to see it. And she had, a security detail and a big sash. And we all had to bow to her individually. And it made such a huge impression on me that like theater was something that you would want to do, that it was important. And also here in Oregon as a child, well, before I was born, my parents were part of this Great Books discussion group. And that group started an annual pilgrimage down to Ashland every year to see the Shakespearean plays, and then they would have discussions afterwards. And the children of those people, it was a big deal when we were finally old enough to go see the plays and then sit in the discussions and hear them talk about the themes and the issues and how they related to today. So that those things were some of the early influences, I think, on why it was that I became interested in studying theater.
And just backing it up to, talking about your father doing tax law, kind of, you being, I guess at that age, being like, this isn't the most, glamorous romantic job in the world. But it's interesting you talk about going down to like pilgrimages to Ashland for the Shakespeare Festival, having these early engagements with theater. So you say, so was it the case where it wasn't as hard a sell on your parents when you were saying, this is what I want to do for my career? Because I know a lot of people,
yeah,
their family has questions.
Yeah, well, sure they did, and they really pushed me when the time came to choose a program, which I did. My undergraduate was at NYU, and NYU, I think it's still the same now. How they have a few different studios that you can study, different theater ways. I mean, I went to the experimental theater wing versus I don't even know if they have it anymore, Circle in the Square or Lee Strasberg studio, right? So different methodologies of getting to theater. But so it was like a conservatory, and 3 days a week we were there from 9:30 to 5, and then the other 2 days a week were all the academics because you're still getting a BFA. So it was lots of school.
And when you talk about just studying in New York and then performing, putting on productions for so long there, like how does that scene differ from Portland? Like I have a certain level of assumptions, but I imagine just part of it's just bigger market, New York City, kind of center of the universe type thing. But then also just as far as specifically, like how also I imagine it probably prepares you to do some things in Portland that you might not be able to do, or in Oregon that you might not be able to do in a place like New York or LA.
Right. I think about like what the word resource breaks into, especially in making theater. And it was my experience, and I think this is generally universally true in New York City, that there are so many people looking to make theater that the competition is super high, and the demand for, well, if you're looking just as an actor, let me back that all up by saying, my first training and way into theater is as a performer. And when I, at least, was in undergraduate, I didn't see myself in a lot of theater that I attended. Um, Maybe also because it was the experimental theater world, and it seems to be from our European uh, influences that a lot of that theater is white, but theater in general here in the United
Mm.
States. And so, I mean, this was a time where like pretty much the only place I saw myself was Lisa Bonet on The Cosby Show. I'm like, okay, that's kind of me. So, and I think also because of my training, there was a heavy influence on making your own work. And we didn't call it devising, we just called it making your own work.
Mm.
And so I never did that audition thing of regional theater. That I didn't have to submit myself to that
But
horror.
but can you back up when you talk
Uh-huh.
about like that audition thing of regional theater?
Right.
I, what do you mean by that? I hear a lot of was it? I'm sorry. Actually, just go on. I'm not gonna
Well,
editorialize.
okay, so I'll tell you two stories about that. Well, so the thing as an actor, um, usually, you have to audition for a part, or if you have a working relationship with a director or a theater, you might just be able to circumvent that and just go be invited to a callback so that they can see you working with the other potential people who are being cast to make a final decision. And then you are offered the role and whatever the contract details are for payment. um, and the timing of rehearsals, right? Are they in the day or the evening? Because presumably you have to have another job, unless you've made it really high where you're
Mm-hmm.
getting paid decent money. But in New York City, especially as a young performer, you were lucky if you got subway fare to
Hmm.
get to and from the theater, right? Because the idea is that uh, your experience of doing this is so valuable to be able to say, oh, I worked with this company, or I even was cast in a production in New York City that is a public one, and the unfortunate part, it's kind of like in the modeling world, the cover of a magazine often pays very little, but doing the catalog work for Sears Roebuck, that's a good daily rate, right? So
Right.
it's like they see a value for you, which is true in the industry for uh, getting a chance to do the thing, right? So uh, the the auditioning is work, right? And you don't get paid to audition ever. You don't in fact, sometimes you pay to audition if you're doing, like, for example, here in Portland. I know I'm kind of bouncing around, and I hope it's okay, but here in Portland we have and it's very smart, it's a very good idea, the Portland Area Theater Alliance. They have kind of these once a year auditions, and different companies can participate. So there's, let's say a weekend, and things are broken by different kind of categories like musical theater, etc. And then so as a performer, I can do one audition and be seen by a large amount of companies, so that they can consider if they want to invite me later for a callback for their season. So, and in that case, as the actor, I pay a nominal fee to participate in this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one way, like, the economics go. I mean, it's this kind of funny thing, like, I know in New York City, and I'm not really sure how high or competitive it is here in Portland. Like, if you're looking to rent an apartment, every apartment that you apply for some reason you have to pay like maybe even $100 or more background check. You would think
Hmm.
like a background check, they could just like, go to the background check place, and that the rental agency, it's their job to vet you, not your job to have to absorb that. So you're paying them this money just to be able to apply for the apartment. It doesn't mean you're going to get the apartment, right? So these kind of like imbalances of like who pays to play
Right.
start to really, and then when you're trying to figure out what your day job is, how to figure out one of those that's flexible enough so that you can go on these auditions or do a rehearsal process. So you're doing two jobs right at the same time. And I think as most artists or entrepreneurs, which are actually the same, if you're an artist, you're an entrepreneur, uh, that's that continual navigation of and since there aren't industry standards, like, or there are unions and there are union wages, but like the talking about how much you're going to get paid to do anything, is always, even for me now, is still very mysterious. Like, well, what is a reasonable rate that I should be paid for this work? And if you break contracts down by hour, then it starts to get really scary.
Hmm.
You're like, oh yeah, this amount of money for 2 months of work, that seems reasonable. And then how many hours can they call you? And that's where the union comes in. Even if you are not a union member, most higher up productions still try to abide by those rules, which can be a little bit, it can be protective and sometimes not.
Oh, but that it's funny when you talk about that. I just think about one, just interviewing specifically people like in the music scene here. When you talk about that play or pay to play issue, and even a big talking point has been about sort of like a bunch of these like big showcases and people kind of like charging relatively unknown artists to pay to be on these showcases, and what are the ethics of that? Or
Mm-hmm.
I mean, honestly, similar. Well, I didn't even say similar. Just a lot of I watch or listen to a lot of, like nerd culture podcasts, and most of them are hosted by like actors living in LA who are very transparent about the process of trying to make it as actors in LA. And most of the story, or I shouldn't say most, but like what you just described is just like, it's, I mean, it's pretty much like the exact same thing. And
Yeah.
it's just this situation of just like navigating, trying to, like you said, it costs money to get to the audition. Never mind if you have a fee to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you have this case where, like I said, like even a showcase where, so you don't have to do the same audition for God knows how many people, but it's still, I don't know. Part of me wants to be like, well, I understand the industry has to make its money somewhere, but also having the people making the art being the ones to pay to make the art, or pay to audition for the opportunity to be a part of the art
Right.
is, yeah, that's.
Yeah. And that's where also, like, when you I mean, I like to think about it as the price of the ticket, right?
Mm,
So for myself, I, did my 4 years of undergraduate, which cost a significant amount of money for my training. And then I did my 2 years of graduate school, which cost a significant amount of money for that training. And then all the years that I have put in to work for, when you put it all out with the hours, very little. And then you put that all together, and if I'm cast in a show, just the what is the value of my participation there for the audience too, right? And so then to go from there, if it's like, okay, well, I this power structure of the industry, I mean, of capitalism, I want to take it back. I want to make the work that's important to me. If I'm going to be doing this like
mm,
this, at least let me make the things that I'm actually curious about and create opportunities for me and people like me to tell our stories. So that's from an early age. I mean, I don't think I had thought of all the way through the ramifications or my manifesto. But I was like, well, if I'm going to do this, I want to do the thing that I'm interested in. And so, I mean, I bounced around a lot in what that could look like adapting a classic, making an original superhero play, working on scripted work that you pay to have the rights to, commissioning playwrights to write original work, and then just having to figure out, like, how do you produce something? You have to find a space. You have to convince other people to be designers. And I mean, the amount of people, even to do, like, for example, walking through Portland with the Panther, which I know you've seen. So just for that play, like, you see Tevin, amazing actor on stage, but like the amount of people it takes to make that show happen is, it's astounding. It's a lot of people who have specific roles to fulfill within that. So then when you look at a production like that, the value, the price of that, the price of everybody, you can never, unless you're charging hundreds of dollars, which then creates this whole other barrier to participation, which I'm against on the face of it, but also, what kind of business is that? That you have to have funding from some other places. So then you have to become a grant writer. You're like, what? So how it is, like, all these hats to hold. And then what you all these hats to hold, but you're not being paid independently for all of these hats. And as a producer, I'm the last person who gets paid. I mean, the idea is supposed to be, it's making so much money that in the end, after everyone is paid their agreed amounts, you get to keep the rest. I've yet to reach that day. And this all very much points to having privilege, having enough resource and privilege to withstand this buffeting, right? It is, have your own transportation. Not maybe in New York City, but here in Portland, it's like having a car is a big deal. As a stage manager, having a car where you can, pick up things and bring them to a particular place, or as a set designer, like, you have to be able, or as a producer, that person is more valuable to me to hire because they can do those things. So I don't have to pay for somebody else also to transport the things and the whole logistics of that. Yeah. To be able to not get paid, like, oftentimes you get paid upon signing the contract, at first rehearsal, and at show opening as a director, right? Because I'm done once the show opens. So can I withstand not being paid on a weekly basis? What are my resources that buffet that in between? You don't. I'm already lining up the work for next year, but there's going to be gaps. So within those places where, like, there's 3 shows happening at the same time, how do we, So these are. I often think about many people I know who are amazing theater makers and just brilliantly talented, and the way our capitalistic system is lined up, they have to sacrifice being able, it's like the end of the day, like the last, this is why we have rehearsals that start like sometimes at 8 o'clock and go to midnight, because that's the only time they can do it, and then get up and go to a job. Or sometimes they just can't even participate in a show because they picked a job to help pay off their student loans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I know that is part of why I can be here. And that privilege that I've had economically, and having a home that I don't have to worry about. I own this home because I inherited it. These are things that help set me up for success. And I wonder about extending that opportunity for others to bring them along. That's something that's important to me. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because one of the big questions always comes up, at least, lack of better terms, like against that notion is like, well, who's going to pay for it then? But I always like to think about, but like, what are we missing as a society? What are we losing out on when we don't invest in this? Especially in a lot of these like creative endeavors and opportunities for people to, again, see themselves, tell stories they don't get to see. And earlier you talked about, early on, really the focus was on being a performer. And I feel like in whatever discipline we're doing, we end up taking on some of these different hats as like a combination of one, just to, explore different facets of creativity and different ideas, but then also, as some form of making the money work. And one, I'm curious, just like if that was kind of the case for you when you talk about being a producer, being a director, casting, grant writing to get money to do these shows. But then also it's like you said, the irony, of course, is that when the show's over, and like especially if you're the producer and you're the last person to get paid, you're doing this to make the money work just so the money doesn't actually come in. Uh yeah, it's just difficult, but again, like I think it's important for people to know in terms of what actually goes into making these works happen.
Yeah.
And kind of to that point, as far as well, specifically in the challenge of getting new works produced. You talked about New York, like, this really this focus on experimental theater. And when you talk about Oregon, though, I know like most of, as someone kind of like outside of theater, most of my engagement with theater productions is kind of like, the traditional things. Go to school, see like Phantom of the Opera or something in like elementary school and stuff like that. But I'm always curious as far as like how it works to engage, because it's one thing to create new works, but then like you got to sell them to a theater, you got to sell them to an audience. And yeah, can you just talk a little bit about, I'm gonna make the assumption that it's an uphill battle, so please, I would love to be wrong about that. But could you just talk about kind of like, again, once we get past, you talked about all the cost earlier, but just like selling the concept of these works and getting people, excited about something that they haven't seen before.
Right.
Which when I say those words out loud, it seems obvious, but it's
Yeah.
challenging.
Yeah. And I mean, I can only talk about my journey and my experience, but okay, well, first I'm just gonna toot my horn a little bit just for a moment.
Please do.
So
Please do.
yeah, so let's see, today's Thursday. So 2 days ago, last Tuesday, we brought a performance of Walking Through Portland with a Panther, The Life of Mr. Kent Ford, All Power, to Grant High School. And it was a free performance for Grant High School. And I'm still so high from that. I'm like so proud because it represents, and now we're embarking next week. We have a performance at Lewis and Clark. The following week, a performance at Reed. The following week, we get to go and stay in a hotel because we're bringing it to Walla Walla, to Whitman College. And then a few weeks after that, Lake Oswego show up for racial justice, which you helped broker that deal. So thank you. So looking at that, we'll like backtrack all the way from its genesis and origin. So 4 years ago, Don Wilson Glenn, the playwright, who is a longtime collaborator of mine, right? So first there's like the value, or like you can't put a price tag on that, but like the value, we were in New York City together for two decades, and at least, well, I think we were working together for at least over a decade. And he had one theater company and I had a very different kind of theater company, but we would help each other like navigate, figure out things, how to write proposals, how to write a press release, we would volunteer to run each other's box office, my company and his company, et cetera, and just have someone else to talk to about, like, am I crazy? Is this wrong? Or is this right? Or how do I manage this thing, right? Which we're not being paid to do. I mean, this is all passion work, right? So myself, Don Wilson Glenn, the actor and artistic director of Confrontation Theater, LaTevin Alexander, who's an amazing performer. If you've seen him in Walking Through Portland with a Panther, and just he's in a show right now at the Playhouse, always performing. The three of us were taking Mr. Ford's walking tour. And we had all taken it individually before, but the three of us were all together that afternoon. And we were talking together as we were walking from one location to another. And LaTevin said, we should do a play about Mr. Ford. And I should play Mr. Ford. And I looked at Don and I was like, that is a brilliant idea. So that is how that even was, like, how that started. But because we had working relationships, there was a trust that was already there, right? So we weren't pulled from a call board, right? And I will also say, I mean, it's kind of a nepotism thing, but it's also, there's going to be so much unknown that I'd rather start with some things that are relatively known. And I would rather continue with as much known as I can, because there's going to be so much unknown, right? So after some more conversations, Don and I were already working on another play together. So we got that one up. But in the meantime, he was beginning to do some research and beginning to have some interviews with Mr. Ford. And then he really started in earnest doing some drafts of the script. And then you ask about, how do you get people interested? And so, well, first you have to get your creative team interested, right? Because if there isn't an excitement and buy-in and trust and embarkment, right? Because even to meet and talk, we're not paid to just meet each other and talk, right? And that's so much of what we need to do. It's not like, I have to interview for a job. It's like you're always having these conversations and interviews and dreaming about how it could be. And like, I feel you need to be going to see other people's work, to see what's happening and who's doing what and who's talking about what. So you can be like, oh, who's the right person? Not about like their skill set. We're just starting with the assumption that people know how to do what they're doing, but like, who's vibrationally, gonna really get into this thing with me. So I mean, happily here in Portland, I've had some time to begin to know some grant makers. And we have here in Portland the Regional Arts and Culture Council, who they are incredible. And the resources that they offer to artists of all kinds of discipline and educators is really phenomenal. And there are other amazing grant makers too, but the Regional Arts and Culture Council helps connect artists in so many different ways and support them. So I'm always give them a shout out. So also then, of course, having the buy-in of Mr. Ford and having the like opportunity to participate, like, to collaborate with him from the beginning on this. But, Mr. Ford is not a theater maker. So there's like, a bit of a, and I know, and to write a play is really hard. And to write a play about an actual person who exists in history has another layer. And then to write an original play about a person who is known and is in the room is
Right.
another layer, right? So that even happened is amazing, and that funders saw the value of having this happen now while Mr. Ford can be in the room, right? Then to get it produced, right? To get it actually on its feet and in the theater and have people come. And part of that, I've kind of always joked, like, it's kind of like being a little bit of a drug dealer. So you invite them like to the first just table read. There's not going to be a bunch of production values, but like so people can kind of just like be like, oh, I kind of know what that is. And it's free, right? You just come in, you see it, it's free. Then the next version, maybe a staged reading of it. We let you in on the process so that you can have some buy-in, so that you can see what happened from that just reading the paper and someone's reading the stage directions to just a little bit of the bells and whistles. Maybe, there are a couple of projections, if that's called for, or some sound cues, right? A little bit of movement happening. So and maybe that costs a little bit of money, but you try to get, and you also have to be strategic in knowing, like, who are the people who will talk about this to the other people. Make sure that they get in, make sure that they can see it so that they can also be part of the conversation. So that then by the time, let's say there's the third version where you're actually getting it fully produced, the people have heard of it because it's a new thing. Like, you're just going to say, walking through Portland with a Panther next Tuesday at 7. What is that? I don't know. So that there is some buzz, right? And making sure that, of course, Laura Laforti, who does our social media, is a wizard at that. So getting engagement and buy-in by having an organization that can help support and amplify that. Like, there's no way as an individual I can do that, even though I create the press release, send it out, have relationships with local media places so that there can be in the listings, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a whole thing, right? So we have the production, it exists, and we made it knowing that we wanted it to be able to travel. So it was being made as a solo show. That's easier. You have one actor instead of the schedules of multiple ones, to create a set that was easy to break down and move from one place to another and travel. And then that the number of technical lighting cues and things like that would be minimal, right? It's it's often known as a trunk show, the idea that the whole show can go in a trunk or two and go on the road. So we made the show with that idea in mind. Then comes being able to make the relationships to get it into the spaces, and to get a play into Portland Public Schools is no small bar, to jump through. Happily for this production, I received a Creative Heights grant through the Oregon Community Foundation that paid for that performance to be brought to Grant High School. But then Grant has to do, there's all the work and the things of saying, yes, it's going to be cool, and yes, we'll get our students there. And, educators are overwhelmed by how much they have to do in their day-to-day. So to set this up, I also want to say thanks to Grant High School and my friend and collaborator, Lynn Yarn, who is a teacher at Grant and who really set this whole thing in motion. So those are just like the steps. It's hard to write a play, original play. It's hard to write a play about someone who is known in history. It's hard to write a new play about someone who's known in history with them as a participant. It's hard to get all the production values up and get it on its feet so that you can see that it works and you can try it. It's hard to then make the connections and figure out all the logistics and get it out onto the road. So I am just I'm still high just knowing that, like, look, we made this happen in 4 years. It is happening. And I'm really, and Mr. Ford, uh um I think he really it appreciates and is pleased. I mean, that's the most important thing, right? That he travels with the productions of it and has conversation afterwards with the audience. So the real Mr. Ford, after you've seen Blitevin play it, he's there in the room. And so that's really, to have that. And then I'm working with Michael Bernard Stevenson Jr., who is a local artist and educator, and making curriculum or conversation materials that actually can get used. That's the hardest part. And how do we make them in such a way so that they are available to educators in a way that educators need them to be, that have some kind of impact for the students and the students or communities, even if it's not in a educational group. But if we take it like to Westminster Presbyterian, well, what kind of materials can we have that they then can continue this conversation and decide ways to take action of whatever that might look like, to have our culture be more inclusive and to not forget the history that Mr. Ford's legacy comes from, so that we can move forward. Now, so that moves into, why do we tell stories? Why theater? What's the importance there? And then for me, it's important to have a step beyond that. I don't want to dictate to you what that step should be, but that there are ways that you can then move forward from there. And this is kind of getting off the topic of the economics, but it's like that to me is the value. How I know it's not going to be the paycheck that I take home, unfortunately, but it's going to be seeing this blossom and continue beyond, right? That's a lot of words.
Well, I would say that I feel like it very much falls under the economics when you talk about the legs, like about Michael Stevenson Jr., for example, creating curriculum, creating things that people can use beyond, and the work behind that as well. But just to to give you a break from tooting your own horn, so I can toot your horn on this, because I just think it's one of the really honestly just most impactful things that probably could have happened to me earlier on in my journalism career, was just being able to meet not just meet Mr. Ford, but have him like invite me into his home to talk with him before we'd had we had no connection or anything at that. Just I was a reporter at the place where if we're being get into all the details, we'll just say he was not necessarily a fan of my employer at the time.
Yeah.
So the fact that he was also willing, because knowing Mr. Ford, like he will tell you how he feels. He's not gonna hold it. And so for someone like, again, with that kind of aura, honestly, to invite me into his home, to be so generous with his time and his just wealth of knowledge, and then to go on to be able to I know there's just in doing like this respond to racism work, which is part of part of what was we're talking about the performance coming up in LO, part of kind of like the path to getting there. But doing that work and having a student be able to reach out and say, hey, I'm doing this project on the Black Panthers. Is there any way the organization can help me out with resources? Like, you know what? We have a connection to Camp Ford. Like we can make this happen. Having being able to see kind of like that same honestly, that same just boost in charge he gave me, being able to like create opportunities for other students, especially. Like I think for the community as a whole, and just for people as a whole, it's important. But like when you talk about doing shows at Grant, talk about these opportunities to, whether it's the shows, whether it's speaking. Well, the shows, like you said, often include Mr. Ford being there as well, but then just these opportunities for young people, especially to engage a guy like Mr. Ford. It's just like, it's invaluable. It's absolutely
Yeah.
invaluable. And just when you talk about all the work it takes to making that happen, again, I'm just like, I'm genuinely, I'm not just saying this because we know each other and we've collaborated, but like, it's so impressive, and like I'm in awe, genuinely.
Well,
Um,
and it's important to pay people like Mr. Ford, who it's like, oh, wouldn't it be great if they came and spoke? Well, you need to pay them. I mean, I'm not saying, we
yeah,
do, but I mean, other places, and I think it's getting a lot better. But you need to pay these people for their experience, for their education, for their for their life experience. However those things happen, there was they could be doing something else at any moment. They could be doing something else. So to pay them to come and speak at your organization, it's invaluable, like you point to. Absolutely.
and you talk about just like all the costs that go into producing a show, and it's almost like a double-edged sword, because on one hand, as like creators, that is definitely is an obstacle. But on the other hand, just applying for grants, going to different fundraisers, or just some of the people you come across in this work, whether it be the foundations that everyone knows, but also just a lot of individuals. Like, it never ceases to amaze me just how much money there is out here, and people who
Oh,
say
yes.
that they are committed, they are invested, they want to support this work. Like, it's not, when we talk about obstacles to getting things produced, it's not because there isn't the money out there.
Sure. Absolutely. 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 I mean, okay, first, I also have to take this moment to also make a shout out to Ronnie Lacroute, who, if it weren't for Ronnie Lacroute, Portland's theater would not be as much variety and as rich. This is just not possible. So period.
Mm.
So that is one thing that is very sets Portland apart. I think. And also, yes, there is so much resource here. I mean, New York City, I mean, you're like, okay, we're going to do a performance in this basement corner of this bar. And there's no dressing room, but there's a bathroom that's, shared by people of the bar down the hall. And that's where you can change, right? And then I run into people here in Portland who are like, the dressing room of that space is not right, And I'm like, and they're right, but also it's just like, here's the difference, and here in Portland, you are paid to be a performer. I mean, there's a wide range of payment, but New York City, and I've never spent time in LA, but not so much. It's the experience that
Mhm.
that's the value of it. So, but here in Portland, we have a hard time. There are resources, but I think some of the bigger theaters are starting to change. I do see some of this changing, but we have a little bit of an inferiority complex, I think, about other larger cities, about jobbing in performers. It used to be something that was huge here. It's beginning to shift a little bit better for supporting local talent. But we would job in people, even though there were people here who could play those roles, job in designers. But we also maybe which comes first, the chicken or the egg, but we have a really hard time retaining designers of color here. So like, having, we don't, there's no black set designer here in town. We just don't have one, period. Like, we're talking about, like, they're at an equity level that I can't afford them for my production. We just don't have one. And for stage managers of color, it is also hard. It's getting a little bit better. I think people are becoming a lot more aggressive about trying to train and keep them and give them an opportunity. And then for Black male actors of the age from 20 to 40, really hard to keep them here. Yet most Black plays have a Black man between the ages of 20 and 40. right? So we, keep having to job them in. So it's like, well, at what point are we going to get to a place where we can retain them here? Because there is resource, but the question is there enough work to sustain them? And that's also your thing too, right? I mean, if you are if you're working as an actor, you pretty much need to be working the whole time to make enough money to just pay your basic bills, right? Um, I will say something about is very just theater centric, but since the pandemic, more theaters, definitely here in Portland, and I'm assuming across the country, have stopped having 6-day work weeks. And that's just how it's been in the theater. You have a 6-day work week. And especially for rehearsal process. And so now we are like, I put, and I think more and more people just have to put their foot down and say, no, 5 days a week and 2 days off in a row. we just can't, it's not sustainable. You talk about sustainable and you talk about resource, you talk about economics. I mean, it's all part of that whole picture. And the burnout rate, especially of theater technicians and designers, is real, because everything's high stakes, right? You only have X amount of weeks and the show must go on. Like George Thorne, a person from Iraq, says that theater has the most on-time delivery of any industry, right? You have we have that joke that it's with construction, it's always going to cost, what is it, like 1.5 times more and take twice as long, or whatever that saying is. When the show is supposed to open and the curtain rises, the curtain rises. Like there's never like, oh, we're going to postpone opening until the pandemic. This has been a real thing, and kind of a shock for everybody. It's like, wait, you mean? I mean, I've seen people go on stage wearing a back brace because they broke their back. I have performed with chickenpox. I mean, the things that we do because no, the show must go on. And it's prohibitively expensive to have understudies for all of the roles. Usually it's just not, we can't afford that. And then that means for most designers that crunch time is those last few weeks of tech. And so it's super high stakes. You can't have anything, you have to be there, you have to do the thing, the show needs to happen. So for a lot of designers, that burnout and that stress is a real thing. And to then retain diversity of voices and experience and lenses of people of color, that's like one more layer where it's like just not happening as much as it should here in Portland. So I will say that. I kind of went on a few different things there, but
no, but again, it's all important. It's all very much relevant. And even when you talk about sort of like Portland kind of more embracing, but still, it's still very much a challenge as far as like understanding the importance of paying people down the line and paying people for, especially for like their expertise and, coming up and showing up into these spaces is always funny to me because it's a relative. Because I look at Portland, I'll see so many very legitimate issues, and then I'll go back to my hometown, Lake Oswego, where there's, at least per capita, there's even more resources. There's even more like individuals who actually just have the disposable income, and again, actually do like very vocally profess their interest in doing these things. Where it's even more, for some reason, it's even more of a sell to do what they have more capacity to do as far as like supporting the arts. Yeah, that's always, it's getting a little bit better, but it's still really, 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 really bad. I just got an email notice about like Oswego schools are looking for a volunteer Black reader. I'm not making that. That's a real story. I'm just like, what?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I mean, I can't tell you how many requests I've had to come and speak at schools, for free about theater or do a little something. I'm like, I it's not that I'm mad at you, but I mean, come on, would you ever ask a doctor? Maybe you would if you were like, it's like, oh, they're a friend. Can you tell me what's wrong with my, the tickle in my throat? But then when it comes to their expertise, I mean, I've been asked to come and perform my solo play, for free at schools. So that is like that is, right? You wouldn't ask a doctor to could you just do some brain surgery on me, please?
Right.
Um, or I mean, I'm just talking about like, things that have a terminal degree or, that kind of thing. It's like this person has a terminal degree or the life experience of a terminal degree, and you're going to ask them to do something for free at your party or your event. It's like, no, no, no.
Yeah. No, it's wild and yet it's so persistent. So we talked about walking through Portland with the Panther, and I do want to like kind of dive into the Vanport Mosaic story, but because you brought up education in schools, we talked about wearing different hats, and one of the ones I didn't talk about earlier was just teaching.
Mm.
And specifically, in teaching theater and kind of like the ways people think about, but also you were doing I don't get the name of the exact program. I believe it was called Rehearsals for Real Life, which I thought
Uh-huh.
it's an interesting concept because I gotta think about this like journalism and whatnot, and trying to like show people ways where this can like apply outside of just like reading the news and stuff like that. But like for those who don't know, like rehearsals for real life, what can you talk about what that is and like what?
Yeah, I haven't been doing that kind of conflict resolution through role play work for a long time. But so how economics worked for me in New York City for over a decade. So for almost a decade, I worked on Wall Street. So that was like, how did that happen? Well, I was a temp receptionist. And then they offered me the job full time. And then they offered me another role within the company, reading news, reading the Dow Jones news, right? This is before you could just look at it on the internet because there wasn't internet yet. I'm that old. So you're reading the news for people who would call about their stocks. Then I'm being offered to manage a department and train. And I was just listening to a story on NPR today about customer service dissatisfaction and how it, as organizations, we value customer service like it's some kind of lowly thing, but it's highly skilled work, that interpersonal skill set. In addition to having to juggle the actual ability to solve a technical problem or whatever, understand what the company's policies are, also to be able to make another individual feel like they're heard and met and supported, right? And the fact that we don't spend time on that is a shame. So just to backtrack, that this Wall Street company I worked for, they were a brokerage house. I ran their broker training department for the whole nation. And so their trainees would come to me, they would be studying to get licensed, but then I would train them in customer service skills and how to talk on the phone. And then they would work in my department reading news to people for like all day long. That's what they would do. And they would learn how to. So it seems like a weird, like, how did that happen? But it made sense to me as a theater maker and as a communicator and as that, a community organizer. I
Hmm.
wasn't yet, but right. And then where am I going? Oh, and so then I had a brief career as a model. Yes, that happened. Check. And then I worked for various teaching artist organizations in New York. And for the last decade that I was in New York, I worked for one called Enact. And their model was team teaching, going into at-risk classes in all the boroughs at the end of all the lines, and offering conflict resolution skills through role play. So we would come in as theater, but giving a situation where at the moment of conflict, there would be the stop, and then having the conversation with the students or the community about, okay, well, what's going to happen next? Okay, do you think that's really what person A wants to happen? What does person A really want to have happen? What needs to happen in this moment? Then there's, it could be a few different answers, but what needs to happen in this moment, that gap, before you choose the next thing? And then to have a student, when I say the next thing, the next action that you take, to have a student step in as that person A who's, I want to have a good day and get my, eat dinner with my family. But I enter this conflict moment. How can I practice in that gap, taking a deep breath, walking away, asking them for clarification, whatever, whatever is offered, let's practice that and see how that feels. Because we all know in that moment of conflict, that moment where everything goes flush in your body, there's usually a trained response of how we handle it. So how are you ever in the real world going to make a different choice if you don't practice it in a little bit of a lower stakes setting? So, I mean, that's applicable for all of us, right?
Mhm.
At all ages, in all situations. Yeah, and I'd actually love to do more of that work, but it's kind of, there isn't an organization here in Portland who's doing that. And that was not the organization I wanted to build necessarily, but yeah.
Right, right. It's funny. It's like I recently took an organizer training where, we were, using role playing exercises just to, practice doing, sort of like one-on-one pitches and like sort of like canvassing stuff. And,
Mm-hmm.
it's something that's kind of like come up in different settings from, stuff like that to, as an example, it's not my favorite, but luckily people don't bring it to me as much anymore. So hopefully that trend will continue. But in the earlier RTR days, one of the asks was like, I want to, yeah, all this other stuff is great, but how do I talk with my family at Thanksgiving? You know, and people really were like, I want to role play, you know, the these holiday conversations at the dinner table. And it's just like, so I say that to say that I see some of these, I guess you could say, like non-traditional opportunities to engage
Mm-hmm.
with the theater, but it feels like you said, like there's not an organization there that's like doing it, at least, you know, at like the scale you might be like envisioning. And
Mm-hmm.
to build that is, you know, everyone say, well, if you don't see it, why don't you build it? Like that, I hate that argument so much sometimes. Like I'm 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 so tired.
Yeah.
Well, you don't anyways,
Yeah,
but
yeah. There's only so much that you can have a passion to move that rock and
mm,
start it going. Yeah. No, I feel you. I feel you.
yeah, it's like I don't know if there's any other like if you're just kind of like looking at the landscape, especially when it comes to like teaching artists, as far as opportunities that might be, there but are just, the dots haven't connected yet, whether it be kind of like having something like more of a like rehearsals for real life type
Mm-hmm.
program or
Mm-hmm.
things like that.
Yeah, yeah, and I will say like that was a big difference of the resource in New York City that especially this company that I worked for in the last decade, Enact. I mean, they paid you well enough, and there was enough work, so like you could, if you could align your schedule right, maybe you teach like 3 classes at one school and then 2 after school classes at another school twice a week, and then you still have enough time, and then like another one every Wednesday, right? It's all kind of patched together, but then you still have some like 1 day or 2 days a week where you have daytime free, so you can go to auditions or go to your meetings or go to your whatever. And then at night you can be a rehearsal right? Or however it is, and that it paid you well enough and the work was consistent enough that that could be your daytime job. And so and then it was this wonderful situation where you have a resource of all of these actors. You are working with working actors. And so you can have those conversations on the side as well and share resources. And one of the biggest things that it can be very lonely, and to just even, I think I pointed to that even before when I was talking about my friend Don Wilson Glenn, to just have someone to talk about how it's going. It's like, am I crazy? Because it can feel like, is this just, am I spending my time the right way? Am I, running this wheel with no little carrot at the end, or so that kind of community is really important. And it's hard. I mean, even like, pointing to this February celebration that we just had, that unfortunately the snowstorm scattered us from being
Mm.
all together, and COVID. But part of the reason that I produce that is, yes, so that the audience community can hear these stories, and learn from them, and consider and action going forward. But also of equal importance is to have a reason for those who are doing the work to come together and just have a chance to like chill and listen to each other, because the the energy that comes from that like gives me the energy to do it again. And I get so jazzed to hear about all the work that everybody else is doing. I mean, I wouldn't be collaborating with you if I hadn't attended one of your events. And to have the time to attend one of your events is like part of that whole scale of like, if I'm in rehearsal 6 nights a week, how am I going to go out to see your event? Right.
Right.
um yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's a great segue into kind of really getting into the Vanport Mosaic story. And like you said, it's kind of like what brought us together. And I think just to that point about community, because it still feels like, it feels like a hard sell often to get people to understand. Like we know it when we know it when we feel it in terms of the importance of community building, but because it's not, a tangible dollars and cents thing, because it's not a linear process, it's often a
Yeah.
frustrating one. It can be hard to just really like emphasize and be like just be a champion for like, no, we need to prioritize and really invest in community building. And sometimes even so, yeah, again, I'm not going to put words in your mouth. So this is me speaking, where it almost feels like when we do these events, in a way, like the events are important, but it's almost like we're also tricking people into doing community building work by trying to get them there. And not because, everyone's like terrible and cynical, just because like we're all tired and busy and we're all looking for any reason not to add anything else to our already overloaded schedules. So
100%.
we're navigating that. But that's again why, coming back to Vanport Mosaic, why I've one enjoyed just collaborating with the organization, but two, just in seeing like there's a value of just like engaging community in terms of like the education factor, engaging with these stories, engaging with our local history, but then also, like you said, just creating excuses sometimes for a lot of us doing this work to be in the same room
Yeah.
and break bread with each other. So with that said, can you just talk about, bring it back to like what those early days in what kind of like brought it together, and like how it's, maybe just, I know again Vanport Mosaic does a lot of things, but if you just do like a kind of like brief overview, kind of like just of like all the different things you all do, if
Oh my
that is
goodness.
possible.
Okay, in like 2 minutes or less. Go. Um, so Laura Laforte was doing a oral participatory multimedia project for the same organization that you had been working with that shall not be named. And she was doing, Laura's Italian, and she did not grow up here. She was doing interviews to Vanport survivors, and she was like, "What? This event happened here? Like, how is not everybody talking about this event of the city of Vanport? Not just the flood, but just that this happened." And I will pause right there to say that I mostly grew up here in Portland, Oregon, and I had never heard of Vanport, period, until it was around the time that I met Laura, because a local playwright brought a play to me that was written about Vanport and was like, "I'm looking for someone to direct and produce this for a reading. Would you be interested?" And I read it and I was like, "Say what now? Say what? What happened?" So Laura, who refers to herself as a story midwife, which is 100% true, was then looking into the community at large for anyone who was telling a Vanport story in whatever medium it was. And so I just coincidentally was working on this new play, Cottonwood in the Flood, written by Rich Rubin, which is a fictitious story, but based on, real events about a Black family that migrated from the South and came and lived in the city of Vanport. And so she came to see a reading of it. And she was out sniffing all of Vanport, like who was doing, someone's doing a walking tour, someone's writing a book, And we came together, and I knew some former Vanport residents who were elders in my community. And I was like, "I didn't realize this was your story too, And so it was getting very sentimental in one degree of separation when I began to have my mind blown about how these things were coming together in my own personal life, right? So one of the things, so Laura and I and Renee Mitchell, Renee Mitchell, the three of us decided that we would make a festival, and then I was going to be it, and just try and bring all these different organizations or individuals, historians, artists. There was exhibits, the short oral history documentaries that Laura had caused to be made, the play that I was working on, someone who offered to give a guided tour of the former Vanport lands, all these different ways, and speakers were talking about these issues, the same issues, and the legacy of the flood, what happened to the city of Portland racially and economically because of Vanport. And then at the heart of it for us was having a private reunion dinner for former residents of Vanport, survivors of the flood, or who had grown up there, and for them to come together, because much like his other thing, many of them hadn't seen each other since those days. So to fet them and also give them an opportunity to be together and share stories and reconnect. And that, honestly was the most beautiful part. And it wasn't a public event, it was for the former residents, the survivors. And that was going to be the end of it. And that was it. And then.
And what year was this?
So this was 8 years ago. What year is that? 16, 15? I don't even know. It just happens every day. And I make a joke, but it's very true that how this all went was like, okay, we had this cart. It was a little, wobbly, but it had all the wheels it needed. And so we started the cart going down the hill. And then we saw some wild ponies over there. And so we got, an apple and some carrots, and the ponies came over, but then the ponies got in the cart. And so then we had to kind of push the ponies out in front of the cart and figure out through a series of rubber bands and whatever, how to harness ponies to the cart, all the while with the cart rolling down the hill. But eventually, we got across the finish line. So, it wasn't a situation where we're like, okay, we're going to make an organization and this is our mission and here's how we see this going. We were like, no, we are going to do a festival and we're going to have a dinner before these people are no longer with us, living on this planet. We're going to do this. We're going to give them their flowers while they're still here. Go. And then it turned out that people were hungry for these stories to continue to be told. And so we're like, okay, we'll do another festival. And then it started to evolve into year-long offerings and new collaborations. And then we had to incorporate. I filed our incorporation papers on a Saturday of the first year of the festival because we had to incorporate so that we could open a bank account so that we could have one place to write checks to people. That's
Mm-hmm.
and now we're a year-long organization that we just had our first official employee. We have an official employee, and then there are the many people who are independently contracted to make the work happen. But so then I also say the Vanport Mosaic is kind of like the story of the blind man meeting the elephant, in which 5 blind men meet an elephant, but one meets the trunk, one meets the tusk, one meets the ears, one meets the tail, and another one meets the foot. I think that was 5. And so they all get back together afterwards and they're like, okay, let me tell you what an elephant is. And they hear each other's descriptions and they're like, no, you're crazy. That's not what an elephant is. So depending on how you meet the Vanport Mosaic, we're like that elephant, because there are exhibits, there are performances, there are documentary screenings, there are conversations, there are tours, walking tours, bike tours, etc. The aim of everything, though, is to through the experience of the event, whatever that event is, to have conversation, to imagine a world where we all belong. And we also use the expression of memory activism, that as an activism role to remember what happened, and everyone might have a slightly different experience of what happened depending on where they come into it, but to actually remember what actually happened, not a revisionist view, helps us so that we don't repeat the same mistakes or the same hurts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, again, just when you talk about the type of community you cultivate and, just the people you might see at any given Vanport Mosaic event and engage with, I think it's very important just because, I know it's not just an Oregon thing, but I can only speak on my Oregon experience where, a lot of people will, how can I put this? They'll use like attending these events as, the be all end all of their engagement, their experience. It's one of my ongoing annoyances, admittedly, when people say, yeah, I gotta go to respond to racism meetings. I've done my job. And it's like, no. Thank you for attending and possibly listening in there, although it doesn't sound like it, but got some more. And I mean, I imagine just how prolific Vanport Mosaic is. There's probably some level of that too, although again, you can only get away with so much of that if you're talking to someone like Mr. Ford. So, but also, it's so important. You talked about paying people earlier. It really, and it's something you want people to do the right thing for the right reasons a lot of times. But again, we talk about putting pressure on institutions to pay people equitably. It does help a lot. I've actively name dropped Vanport Mosaic a lot and saying, actually, no, people are doing this and this exists, and you get a very, if you want to put it on strictly pragmatic, detached terms, like you get a great product when you do that as well. Like everyone wins when
Yes.
we do this.
Well, and also this idea of redistributing wealth as activism, right? I mean, if we are talking about justice or reparations, or I mean, there's kind of scary words, but it's like, yeah, who is being valued? Once again, going all the way back to like, how do you establish a taxation system? What is being funded? Who is, and then who is in charge of those funds? Who's making those decisions, right? When you're like looking at boards, who's the makeup of that board? Who's making these decisions of how monies will be spent? Who gets that trickle down, right? Or who gets funds to do something with? That's different than trickle down, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who is given whether, the resources, whether it's space, time, money, whatever, to tell the story that they want to tell, as opposed to the knowledgeable organization or individual coming in and saying, oh, here's the story. Now I'm going to take the story and tell it the way it needs to be told, as opposed to giving the resources to this community to tell the story, right? So that, like, telling stories with instead of about. If you have that resource, you need to listen to how they want to tell the story. It might not be the story that you think it is. Sorry, it got very preachy for a moment.
No, but again, sometimes talk about these things and briefly find ourselves back in like some meeting room or some Zoom call. You get flashbacks, I know.
Yeah.
Like I said, I do think it's just, again, not to just, toot your horn because you're on here, but seriously, as far as just being able to, again, have those examples in the community where you can go into these meetings and say, I'm not just, I mean, it's weird to be like, I have to defend this idea of paying people equitably in itself is wild, but unfortunately, a lot of negotiations that's real. So it is invaluable, again, to be able to have these models in the community where you can say, no, this is actually happening and it's working very well, and also, if nothing else, puts a little bit more pressure on these institutions to be like, crap, our excuse of that this is, some imaginary science fiction concept is kind of going out the window here. So
right
on. But on Damaris, I want to thank you again for being so generous with your time today. Before I let you leave, though, I always ask everyone in these interviews is, what is one thing in the world of art that's not a project you're working on that's exciting you right now?
I just saw in a Portland Playhouse of a play called What I Learned in Paris by the playwright Pearl Cleage. I think I'm saying her name right. That I did not know the script. And it's, I think, one of the first times in my life that one of the main characters, I was like, that's me. That's me. Yeah, so that has really jazzed me. I'm like, I don't feel like I've ever actually had that really, really happen before to me. So that was really exciting. I feel like that wasn't like a very, super dynamic, but that is something that happened that I'm still very touched with, that I got to experience. Yeah.
No. It's funny because I've just was talking with another person in the theater community. That was definitely a play I was recommended to go see. So, your cosign definitely helps it. But yeah, Damaris, thanks again for just all the time and insight today.
Thanks, Bruce.